I wasn't supposed to get the wedding invitation. At least that's what everyone in my small town thought. For years, my son barely spoke to me, and I thought I'd missed my only chance to make things right. But then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. My heart raced when I opened it, until I noticed something strange. It wasn't signed by my son. It was signed by his fiancée. I decided it didn't matter. Maybe this was her way of extending an olive branch, of helping him reconnect with me. I spent days working in my shed, crafting a small wooden box from maple. Smooth edges, my initials carved discreetly inside the lid. I placed an envelope of cash beneath the lining. It wasn't just a gift. It was my way of saying, I'm here. I've always been here. But when the big day came, the smiles I expected weren't there. My son looked surprised, almost uneasy to see me. His fiancée's family didn't even greet me. A few whispered glances, a cold silence at my table. Then, the moment I'll never forget. A woman I'd never met walked straight up to me, her voice low and firm. Your presence here isn't appropriate. We need you to leave. And in that moment, standing there with my gift in hand, I realized something that shook me more than their rejection. My son didn't say a single word to stop them. I'm 58 now, and the years have a strange way of blurring together when you spend most of them working with your hands. For decades, I shaped wood into tables, cabinets, and staircases for other people's homes. But I never managed to shape my own life the way I wanted. I live alone now, in a modest house in Ohio. My wife, God rest her soul, passed away 5 years ago. And my son, well, my son has been more of a photograph on my mantle than a presence in my life. We weren't always this way. When he was born, I thought I'd finally have someone who would know me better than anyone else ever could. But when he turned 8, the marriage broke apart. I didn't fight for custody the way I probably should have. At the time, I told myself it was because my work schedule didn't fit the role of a full-time parent. In truth, I didn't know how to fight without making things worse. So the court decided he would live with his mother, and I would see him on weekends. Weekends turned into phone calls. Phone calls turned into missed calls, and missed calls turned into silence. I buried myself in work, building furniture for strangers, while my son grew up in a house I wasn't welcome in. Every birthday gift I sent felt more like a message in a bottle than a celebration. I told myself there would be a day when he'd understand why I wasn't there as much as I should have been. That day never came. For years, I lived with the quiet knowledge that I'd failed him in ways that couldn't be sanded smooth or glued back together. Then, one afternoon, as I sorted through the usual stack of bills and flyers, I saw an envelope with my son's name printed across the top. My heart kicked in my chest. I ripped it open with trembling hands. It was a wedding invitation. For a few moments, I just stared at the embossed lettering, unable to process what I was holding. He was getting married, and I was invited, but then I noticed something that twisted my stomach. The invitation wasn't signed by my son. It was signed by his fiancée. Her handwriting was elegant, formal, polite. We would be honored to have you join us, it read. I didn't know what to make of it. Had my son wanted me there? Or was this her idea? Some kind of olive branch extended on his behalf? I sat at my kitchen table for hours, staring at the card, running my fingers over the smooth paper. It didn't matter who had signed it. This was the chance I'd been waiting for. That night, I went into my workshop. If I was going to show up, I wouldn't arrive empty-handed. I pulled a block of maple from the shelf. Fine-grained, smooth, the kind of wood that holds warmth in its color. I decided to make a small box, the kind that could sit on a dresser or a mantel. I sanded the edges, chiseled a subtle groove along the lid, and carved my initials discreetly on the underside. Inside, I lined it with soft felt, then tucked an envelope beneath the lining. Inside the envelope was money, not a fortune, but enough to help them start their life together. Every cut of the chisel, every stroke of sandpaper felt like a piece of myself going into that box. It wasn't just a gift. It was an apology, a promise, and a plea, all wrapped into something tangible. When it was finished, I held it in my hands and imagined giving it to my son. I pictured him smiling, maybe even hugging me, maybe saying the words I'd been hoping to hear for years. "Thanks, Dad." But late that night, as I placed the box carefully into its wrapping, a thought struck me. What if this invitation wasn't really from him? What if he didn't even know I was coming? The idea gnawed at me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder. When I walked into that wedding, would he see me as a guest or as an intruder? The morning of the wedding, I dressed as carefully as I could. My best suit had been hanging in the closet for years, worn only for funerals and court dates back in the old days. I pressed it as neatly as my old iron would allow. I polished my shoes until they shone faintly under the kitchen light. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I didn't see the man I used to be. I saw someone trying to make a good impression on a son who had every reason to doubt him. The drive to the venue took nearly an hour. I rehearsed small things I might say to my son. "You look great. I'm proud of you." But each line felt stiff in my mouth. I was nervous, but I told myself it would be worth it the moment I saw his smile. When I pulled up to the venue, my breath caught. It was a grand estate, white columns, perfectly trimmed hedges, cars lined neatly in the parking area. Guests in crisp suits and flowing dresses walked toward the entrance in clusters. I stepped out of my truck, clutching the carefully wrapped wooden box like a lifeline. Inside, the hall was stunning. Crystal chandeliers glimmered overhead, the air rich with the scent of flowers. But as soon as I stepped in, I noticed something I hadn't expected. Eyes. Dozens of them. Family members from the bride's side filled the space, their voices low, glances flicking toward me as though trying to place my face. I caught a fragment of a whisper. "Is that him?" Another voice, hushed but sharp. I didn't think he'd actually come. I looked around for my son, spotting him near the altar taking photographs. His smile seemed genuine in the pictures. But when his eyes met mine across the room, the smile faltered. He gave a quick wave, barely more than a polite acknowledgement, before turning back to the photographer. The air around me felt heavier with every step. I found a spot along the wall, trying not to block anyone's path. As I stood there, a man in his 50s, someone from the bride's family, judging by the matching boutonniere, walked past and murmured just loud enough for me to hear, "Best not to cause any trouble today." His tone wasn't threatening, but it wasn't friendly either. I forced a small nod, unsure what else to do. Determined not to make a scene, I approached a group at one of the refreshment tables, offering a smile and a polite greeting. "Beautiful ceremony, isn't it?" I said to a middle-aged couple. The woman gave a tight smile before turning back to her conversation. The man simply nodded once, then drifted away. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that not everyone knew me. They had no reason to be warm. But as I moved around the room, the pattern repeated. A quick glance, a polite nod, then an intentional turn away. When it came time to be seated, I looked for my place card. My heart sank when I found it. My seat was at a table far from the head, tucked close to the exit. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter where I sat, but it was impossible to ignore the symbolism. I set the gift box carefully on the table beside me, hoping someone might ask about it. No one did. Guests chatted animatedly at nearby tables, but no conversation reached mine. I poured myself a glass of water just to have something to do with my hands. Every so often, I glanced toward my son, hoping to catch his eye. Each time, he was busy, laughing with friends, posing for another photo, talking to his new in-laws. I told myself he was just caught up in the whirlwind of the day. But with every passing minute, the distance between us felt less like circumstance and more like choice. The hum of voices around me felt like static in my ears. I shifted in my chair, watching as waiters passed trays of champagne, the bubbles catching the light like tiny sparks. Still, no one approached my table. The wooden box sat there, perfectly wrapped, its ribbon untouched. It might as well have been invisible. Somewhere deep down, a quiet, unwelcome thought began to stir. Maybe this wasn't my place. Maybe it never was. I sat at my table, watching the ceremony unfold from a distance. The vows were exchanged, applause rippled through the hall, and glasses clinked. I wanted to believe the discomfort in the room was just my imagination, but then I noticed a woman making her way toward me. She was impeccably dressed, her hair pinned in an elegant twist, her expression sharp enough to cut glass. I recognized her from the seating area near the bride. This was her mother. She stopped at my table, her posture poised and cold. "Mr. Wilson?" she said, her voice carrying a polite edge that made my stomach knot. "Yes?" I straightened, instinctively hoping she might offer some kind of welcome. Instead, her next words came like a hammer. "Your presence here isn't appropriate. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. What? She didn't flinch. "It's best for everyone if you make an exit quietly. We'd like the day to remain pleasant." For a moment, my ears roared. I searched her face for some trace of kindness, some explanation. But her expression was carved from stone. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of my son, standing just a few feet away. He was close enough to hear every word. For one suspended second, I waited for him to step forward, to say something, anything. But he didn't. He glanced at me, then quickly looked back at his wife, adjusting his tie. My chest tightened as the weight of his silence sank in. The mother of the bride's gaze stayed fixed on me. "I think you understand." I wanted to argue, to demand to know why. But my throat felt tight, the words dying before they could form. Around us, laughter and music carried on, as though nothing was happening. I nodded once. The movement slow, heavy. "I understand," I said quietly. She gave a curt nod and stepped back, allowing me space to rise. I picked up my jacket, my eyes landing on the wooden box still sitting on the table. My hands hovered over it for a moment. Part of me wanted to take it, to keep it safe from this cold room. But another part of me thought maybe, just maybe, if I left it behind, it might still find its way to him. I set the box neatly at the center of the table, straightened the ribbon, and stepped away. The room seemed quieter as I walked toward the exit, though I knew it was just my ears ringing. My steps felt heavy, each one echoing in my chest. I kept my head down, hoping to slip away unnoticed. But as I neared the door, I allowed myself one last glance over my shoulder. My son was looking at me. It wasn't anger on his face. It wasn't indifference either. It was something harder to name. Regret, maybe. His mouth opened slightly, as though he might speak. But then he turned back to the crowd. And just like that, I stepped out of the venue into the crisp afternoon air. Outside, the sounds of the celebration faded. The air was cool against my face, the sun warm on my shoulders. For a moment, I just stood there in the parking lot, my hands empty, my chest hollow. It should have been a day of celebration, a new beginning. Instead, it felt like the final chapter of a story I'd been trying to rewrite for decades. I walked slowly to my truck, the gravel crunching under my shoes. As I started the engine, I caught a reflection of myself in the rearview mirror, older than I remembered, more tired than I wanted to admit. The wooden box, the carefully chosen words, the hope I'd carried into that venue. It was all behind me now, and in its place was silence. The drive home was a blur. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, but my mind was caught somewhere between the echo of the mother of the bride's words and the silence of my son. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the house in shadow. Inside, the air felt heavy. I dropped my jacket over the back of a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. The silence was deafening. The image of my son standing there, doing nothing, kept replaying. I tried to remember the last time we had a real conversation. Something more than the occasional polite text or brief holiday call. It had been years. I thought back to the weekends when he was young. I remembered picking him up at his mother's house, the way he'd race down the driveway with a backpack bouncing on his shoulders. We'd spend the day building little projects in my workshop or fishing by the lake. I thought those memories might be enough to keep us close, but time had a way of eroding everything, especially when the visits became fewer, the calls shorter, until they vanished altogether. Now, sitting alone at the table, I realized the wedding hadn't been a bridge. It had been a wall, a final, quiet declaration that I no longer had a place in his life. I stared at my phone, tempted to call him, to demand an explanation. But what good would it do? That's when the phone buzzed. A new message flashed on the screen. It was from an unknown number. It's not his fault. You should know the truth. My heart skipped. I stared at the message, unsure what to make of it. My first thought was that it might be a cruel joke. But the words didn't feel like mockery. They felt like a warning. I typed back, "Who is this?" A pause. Then another message. "Someone who saw what happened today. Call me if you want to know why." A phone number followed. I hesitated for a long moment, then dialed. The voice that answered was low, careful. "Mr. Wilson?" "Yes," I said, my pulse quickening. "Who am I speaking with?" "This isn't about me," the voice said. "It's about your son and his wife's family. You need to understand why things happened the way they did." I gripped the phone tighter. "Go on." There was a pause, as if the caller was choosing their words. "Her mother doesn't want you around because of what she's been told. She believes you abandoned your son. She thinks you walked away and never looked back." I felt my chest tighten. "That's not true." I know," the voice interrupted. But that's the story she's been told. By your ex-wife. The words landed like a punch. My ex-wife? Yes. Years ago. She said you didn't fight for custody because you didn't care. She told people you chose work over your son, that you stopped showing up. Over time, it became the version of events everyone believed. The mother of the bride was just protecting her daughter from someone she thought was a bad man to have around. I sat back in my chair, my hand trembling around the phone. I remembered the court hearings, the paperwork, the endless conversations that went nowhere. I'd thought staying quiet would make things easier for my son. I never imagined my silence would become the weapon used against me. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I saw the way you looked at him today, the voice said softly, and because I think he's caught in the middle. This wasn't his doing. He's under pressure. That's all I can say. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there for a long time, staring at the darkened window, my reflection faint against the glass. The story I thought I'd been living, my son's distance, his silence, his hesitation, suddenly looked different. The past I'd blamed myself for was more complicated than I'd realized. And now, I knew this wasn't just about an awkward wedding. It was about a truth that had been buried for decades. 2 days passed after the wedding. I didn't expect to hear from my son. Truthfully, I wasn't sure I wanted to. But on the third evening, just as I was cleaning up after dinner, my phone rang. It was his name on the screen. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the answer button. When I finally picked up, my voice was steadier than I felt. Hello? There was a long pause, then his voice, quiet. Dad, I'm sorry. I froze. It had been years since I'd heard those words from him. Sorry for what? I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. For what happened at the wedding. For not saying anything. For letting them. His voice trailed off, heavy with guilt. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone. Why didn't you stop them? Another pause. Because I was put in a position I couldn't get out of. They made me choose, Dad. My wife's family made it clear. They didn't want you there. They said if I pushed back, it would ruin everything. I thought maybe the best thing I could do was keep the peace. His words stung, but beneath the hurt was something else, a thread of truth I hadn't expected to hear. You wanted me there, I said, not as a question, but as a statement. Yes, he replied quickly. I wanted you there. I didn't sign the invitation because I was afraid you'd say no. I thought if she sent it, maybe you'd feel more welcome. But I never wanted this to happen. For the first time in years, a small flicker of hope stirred in me. I can't change what happened, he continued, but I need you to know. I didn't forget about you. I just didn't know how to fight them without making everything worse. I took a deep breath, my chest tight. Son, I never walked away from you. Not then, not now. You've got to know that. I do, he said softly. I know more than they think I do. I've always known. When the call ended, I sat in silence, staring at the worn wood of my kitchen table. Something had shifted. Not enough to fix everything, but enough to open a door that had been shut for a very long time. I knew then that staying quiet wasn't an option anymore. The next morning, I sat at my desk and began to write. It wasn't a letter to my son. It was a letter to everyone who had been told the wrong version of my story. I addressed it to my son, my ex-wife, my new daughter-in-law, her parents, and a handful of family friends. I started from the beginning, with the truth. I wrote about the custody battle, the weekends we spent together, the calls I never stopped making, the projects we built in my shop. I wrote about how I'd miss birthdays, not because I didn't care, but because the court order and distance made every visit a negotiation. I included pictures, snapshots of us fishing, sanding wood, building the treehouse he'd begged for one summer. I scanned old notes he'd written me, Father's Day cards he'd made by hand. I didn't write with anger or accusation. I wrote with honesty. My words weren't meant to shame anyone. They were meant to remind my son and everyone else that the narrative they'd been told wasn't the only one. When I finished, I read it over once, then attached the photos and hit send. I didn't expect much, but within hours, I started getting replies. An aunt from my ex-wife's side wrote, "I didn't know. I wish someone had told me back then." A cousin of the bride responded simply, "They owe you an apology." Even more surprising, there was silence from the mother of the bride, a silence that spoke volumes. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my son. "I saw the letter," he said. His voice sounded different, lighter, maybe. "I think they're starting to realize the truth. Thank you for not making it ugly, for just telling it how it was." "It's the only way I know how," I replied. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight on my chest ease, not because everything was fixed, but because the truth was no longer buried. In the days that followed my letter, there was no explosion, no dramatic confrontation. The world didn't shift overnight. But something in the air felt different, lighter, as if a storm that had been hovering just above my head had finally started to move on. The bride's family didn't call me, but the silence changed in tone. It wasn't the cold, brittle silence of hostility. It was the cautious quiet of people who weren't ready to apologize, but also weren't willing to keep fighting. That was enough for me. My son started texting me more. At first, it was small things. Updates about the weather where he was, a quick note to say they'd arrived at their honeymoon destination safely. I didn't push him. I replied simply, warmly, letting the conversation grow at its own pace. One evening, about a week after they'd left for their trip, I got a message from him. No words. Just a photo. It was a picture of the little Airbnb cottage where they were staying. On the small coffee table in the center of the room sat the wooden box I'd made, polished ribbon still intact. I stared at the image for a long time, my chest tightening. He hadn't just accepted the gift. He'd brought it with him. I typed a simple reply. "Looks like it found a good home." His response came almost immediately. It did. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. I didn't expect daily conversations, and I didn't demand them. But each text, each photo, each casual update felt like a thread being carefully tied back between us. It wasn't the strong rope it once could have been, but it was something. I thought often about what had happened at the wedding, about the years that led us there. I realized I'd been so focused on the single day as a chance to fix everything that I'd forgotten something important. Some bridges aren't rebuilt in one moment. They're repaired piece by piece, plank by plank. His birthday came and went without much ceremony, and that was fine. I didn't expect an invitation or a celebration. I sent him a card and a message. He thanked me. That was enough. But then a few months later, my own birthday rolled around. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. I planned to spend the evening quietly, maybe make a simple dinner and sit out on the porch. Just as I was setting the kettle on the stove, There was a knock at the door. I opened it, and there he was, my son. He was standing on the porch, holding a small box. This one from a bakery, the white cardboard tied with a thin ribbon. "Happy birthday, Dad," he said. His voice was a little awkward, but his smile was real. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stepped aside, and he walked in, setting the cake down on the table where my letters and projects usually sat. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't talk about the letter. We didn't even talk about the years we'd missed. Instead, we sat at the table, shared the cake, and talked about small things. The weather, his honeymoon, the new coffee table he'd been building for their apartment. It wasn't the dramatic reunion I'd once imagined. It was something quieter, more fragile, but infinitely more real. That night, after he left, I sat alone at the table, the empty cake box in front of me. I realized something I wish I'd known years ago. Making amends isn't about one grand gesture. It's about showing up, consistently, without demanding anything in return. You can't force someone to forgive you. You can't rush trust. You can only be there when they're ready. And sometimes, just being there is enough. I didn't know if our relationship would ever be what it could have been. But for the first time in decades, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Hope. And as I glanced at my phone before bed, I saw a new message from him. Just 3 words. "Talk soon, Dad." For now, that was all I needed.